They say a wild animal never forgets a face. But what 73-year-old Harlon Merryweather didn't know was that a predator was about to rewrite the final chapter of his life. In the frozen silence of Big Sky, Montana, a debt of life was about to be paid, turning a lonely mountain road into the stage for a miracle that would melt a million hearts and prove that sometimes the wild knows exactly who needs saving. The heat air in Big Sky didn't just feel cold. It felt heavy, a thick, suffocating shroud of fog and frost that clung to the pine needles and blurred the line between the earth and the gray morning sky. For Harlon Merryweather, known to everyone in town simply as Hawk, the road leading out of the mountains felt like a path through half-forgotten memories. At 73, Hawk was a man who had grown used to the silence. It had been 5 years since his wife, Margaret, had passed, and since then, his log cabin had grown larger and colder with every passing season. Every breath Hawk took emerged as a visible cloud, hanging for a moment in the stillness of the truck's cabin before dissolving into nothingness. To Hawk, his life felt much the same way, suspended, caught in that fragile space between waking and dreaming, between a life once lived with passion and the inevitable quiet of the end. He gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck, his knuckles white and gnarled by years of hard labor and the creeping bite of arthritis. His hands were trembling, but not just from the cold. Today was the day. The follow-up appointment. The one where the doctors at the clinic would stop using gentle euphemisms and give him the hard truth about his end-stage heart disease. 4 months, he had felt the fluttering bird in his chest, an irregular, weak rhythm that reminded him with every skip and jump that his time was a dwindling resource. He had braced himself for the worst. He had even started looking at the wood beams of his cabin ceiling as if they were the lid of a box, pressing down on him with the weight of time slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Just get to the clinic, Hawk," he muttered to himself, his voice a gravelly whisper in the empty truck. 1 foot in front of the other, 1 mile at a time. But the mountains had other plans. The screech of brakes tore through the morning mist, a violent, metallic scream that echoed off the invisible mountainsides. The truck jolted, skidding slightly on a patch of black ice before coming to an abrupt, heart-stopping halt. Metal groaned against frozen asphalt. Then, silence returned, heavier than before. Hawk's heart pounded irregularly against his ribs, a frantic, panicked beat. He gasped for air, his lungs burning. For a moment, he thought the end had finally arrived in the form of a cardiac arrest right there on Highway 191. But as his vision cleared and his breath slowed, he realized he hadn't hit a patch of ice. He had stopped because of an image so utterly illogical that his mind refused to process it. Standing in the middle of the road, barely 30 centimeters from his front bumper, was a creature of legend. A female snow bobcat. She was magnificent and terrifying all at once. Her coat was thick, a mottled tapestry of silver, cream, and charcoal, perfectly designed to vanish into the winter landscape. But she wasn't trying to vanish. She stood perfectly motionless, her tufted ears alert, staring straight through the windshield with eyes that looked like polished jade. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't fleeing. She was waiting. What in the name of? Hawk's voice trailed off. He had lived in these mountains his whole life. He knew that bobcats were ghosts. They were solitary, shy, and avoided humans at all costs. Yet, this one was making herself impossible to ignore. The bobcat met his gaze with a calm, eerily unsettling look. Hawk felt a cold sweat bead across his forehead despite the frigid air seeping through the truck's worn seals. Was he hallucinating? Was this the hypoxia of a failing heart playing tricks on him? Then, the impossible happened. With a fluid, powerful grace, the bobcat leapt. The metal of the hood creaked under her weight as she landed softly. Hawk recoiled, his back hitting the seat. She was right there, separated from him only by the thin, salt-streaked glass of the windshield. Up close, he could see the individual whiskers, the rise and fall of her chest, and the profound intelligence in her eyes. But it was what she carried in her mouth that stopped Hawk's heart entirely. With extraordinary gentleness, the predator lowered her head and set something down on the hood of the truck. It was a tiny, trembling ball of fur. A white kitten, no bigger than the palm of a man's hand. It was alive, but barely. Its tiny body shook violently against the cold steel of the truck. Hawk's first instinct was one of grim logic. He thought he was witnessing a predator preparing a meal. But the bobcat didn't bite. Instead, she nudged the kitten toward the glass with her nose. Then, she raised a heavy, furred paw and scratched at the windshield. It wasn't an attack. It was a deliberate, rhythmic scraping. Scrape, scrape, scrape. She was signaling. She was communicating across the divide of species, reaching out to the only other living soul in that frozen wilderness. Hawk sat frozen, his mind racing. Rationality screamed at him that this was insane. Animals didn't ask for help. They didn't bring orphans to humans. And yet, there she was, Sirocco, as he would later name her, looking at him with a desperation that mirrored his own. "You're asking me?" Hawk whispered, his hand hovering over the door handle. "You're actually asking me for help?" Something deeper than thought, something older than his illness or his grief, urged him to respond. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the biting cold. The air hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees buckle for a moment. He felt unsteady, perhaps from the shock or his medication, but he forced himself to stand. The bobcat watched him. She didn't growl. She didn't crouch in a hunting stance. She simply watched as this fragile, white-haired man approached her. Hawk reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of dried venison jerky he kept for long drives. He offered it with a trembling hand, hoping to lure her away, to return the world to some semblance of normalcy. Sirocco didn't even look at the meat. Her focus was absolute. She lowered her head again, nudging the white kitten toward Hawk. Hawk crouched down, his joints protesting with every inch. He reached out and touched the kitten. It was ice cold. Its ribs were visible through its sparse white fur, and its breathing was a faint, shallow rattle. It was dying. "All right, little one," Hawk murmured, the sound of his own voice surprising him with its tenderness. "I've got you. I promise I've got you." He tucked the tiny creature inside his heavy coat, feeling the sudden, sharp contrast of the kitten's chill against his own chest. He looked up at the bobcat, expecting her to flee now that her burden was taken. Instead, Sirocco jumped down from the hood and blocked his path back to the driver's side door. She looked at him, then glanced back over her shoulder toward the dense tree-line shrouded in fog. She walked a few paces, stopped, and turned her head to see if he was following. The message was unmistakable. "There is more." Hawk looked at his watch. His appointment, the appointment that would decide his fate, was in 40 minutes. If he missed it, it could be weeks before he could see the specialist again. He looked at the fog, then at the wild animal waiting for him. "I'm a fool," Hawk said to the wind. "A dying old fool." He turned away from the safety of his truck and followed the bobcat into the mist. He walked about 200 meters, each step a struggle through the thinning snow. His heart skipped beats, his chest felt tight, but the sight of a silver-gray tail ahead of him acted like a tether, pulling him forward. They reached a rocky hollow, shielded by a cluster of frozen hemlocks. As the fog lifted slightly, the grim reality of the situation was revealed in stark detail. There, lying on the frozen earth, was a domestic tabby cat. She was motionless, her body already stiff. It was clear she had been struck by a vehicle during the night and had crawled here to die. Beside her, huddled against her cold fur for a warmth that was no longer there, were 2 more kittens, both a pale beige, shivering and mewing with a sound so weak it was barely audible. The weight of understanding crashed over Hawk. Sirocco, the wild bobcat, had found this orphan family. She couldn't nurse them all. She couldn't save them alone. So she had taken the white one, the most visible one, and gone to the road to find a savior. She had chosen him. Out of all the people who could have driven down that road, she had stopped the man who felt he had nothing left to live for. Hawk knelt in the snow, ignoring the damp cold seeping into his jeans. He gathered the 2 beige kittens into his arms, nesting them alongside their sibling inside his coat. They were so small, so impossibly fragile. "I've got you all now," he whispered, tears pricking his eyes for the first time in years. He looked up to find Sirocco, standing just a few feet away. She didn't move. She simply watched as the man she had recruited took over the burden of care. In that moment, the boundary between wild and domestic, between predator and prey, simply vanished. There was only the shared mission of survival. Hawk stood up, his heart thudding a steady, purposeful rhythm. He didn't know how much time he had left, but as he turned back toward his truck with 3 lives tucked against his heart, he knew one thing for certain. The doctor's appointment could wait. Today, Hawk had a reason to keep breathing. The walk back to the truck felt longer than the journey into the mist. Every step Hawk Merryweather took was deliberate, his heavy boots crunching through the thin, treacherous layer of snow that coated the mountain road. Inside his coat, the 3 kittens, the white one Sirocco had presented and the 2 beige siblings rescued from the rocky hollow, felt like tiny, cooling stones against his chest. They were so small, so impossibly fragile, that Hawk feared even his own shallow breaths might overwhelm them. He could feel their faint, rhythmic shivering, a desperate biological plea for a warmth their mother could no longer provide. Reaching the old pickup, Hawk fumbled with his keys, his fingers numb from the biting Montana air. His mind was a storm of conflicting impulses. Rationality screamed that he was a 73-year-old man with end-stage heart disease, skipping a life-altering medical appointment. Yet, as he looked at the dashboard clock, the number seemed distant and irrelevant. The important appointment that was supposed to determine his remaining days had been eclipsed by the immediate, pulsing need of the creatures tucked against his ribs. Before climbing into the driver's seat, Hawk pulled out his cell phone. The signal was weak, flickering like a dying candle, but it was enough. He dialed the clinic, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years. "I'm sorry, Dr. Thorne," Hawk said, his breath hitching as he spoke into the receiver. "I can't make it. Today, I have something more important than my own life." There was a heavy pause on the other end, followed by the familiar, concerned voice of the physician who had been preparing Hawk for the end for months. Hawk didn't wait for a protest or a lecture on his health. He hung up, turned the key, and felt the truck roar to life. He began the slow, careful drive back toward town, unaware that the world of the wild had not finished with him yet. In the chaos of his own heart and the frantic rescue, Hawk had left the back door of the truck bed slightly ajar. Quiet as a shadow merging with the gray morning, Sirocco had leaped into the vehicle, settling herself among the old blankets and rusted tools in the back. She was coming with them. The Reimarist Clinic sat on the edge of Big Sky, a modest veterinary practice that served as the heartbeat of the local animal community. Dr. Calloway Thorne and his assistant, Juniper Junie Vale, were already at the door when the truck skidded to a stop. They had been expecting Hawk for his cardiac follow-up, but the sight that greeted them was anything but routine. Hawk emerged from the truck, his face pale and lined with exhaustion, clutching his coat as if he were carrying the crown jewels. "I need help," he rasped. "Not for me. For them." The clinic erupted into a blur of controlled chaos. Warming blankets were rushed from the back, and formula was mixed with practiced efficiency. It was only then, as they began to transfer the kittens to the exam table, that Junie let out a sharp intake of breath. She pointed toward the window. There, sitting regally on the bed of the truck, was the bobcat. "Hawk," Dr. Thorne whispered, his eyes wide. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." "She's the one who found them," Hawk replied, his voice trembling. The scene that followed was one that would be whispered about in Big Sky for generations. Instead of fleeing the scent of humans and medicine, Sirocco allowed herself to be led into the clinic. She seemed to understand the sanctuary of the space. As Dr. Thorne and Junie worked on the kittens, Sirocco watched with those impossibly intelligent, jade eyes. During a quiet moment in the examination, Dr. Thorne turned his attention to the bobcat. He confirmed she was female and, surprisingly, lactating. "She gave birth recently, Hawk," Thorne noted, his expression darkening. "Maybe weeks ago. It's likely she lost her own litter." As the doctor gently parted the thick, mottled fur around her neck, he found something that made Hawk's throat tighten, a deep, hairless ring of scar tissue. "An old snare scar," Thorne murmured. "Someone trapped her once. She's known the worst of us." Hawk reached out, his arthritic hand hesitating before resting on the bobcat's head. To his amazement, she didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch, her eyes half-closing. "I don't understand why she trusted me," Hawk whispered. "After what people did to her, why me?" Dr. Thorne looked up from the smallest kitten, his gaze thoughtful and heavy with a wisdom that transcended medicine. "Animals know things we don't, Hawk." He paused, looking at the old man whose own heart was failing. Maybe she saw something in you. Maybe she knew you needed saving as much as these little ones did. The words hit Hawk with the force of a physical blow. He turned away, blinking rapidly to hide the tears that threatened to spill. 4 months, he had been a man waiting for a clock to run out. A man who felt his utility to the world had vanished along with his wife. But looking at the 3 tiny lives now stabilized and the wild mother who had brokered this impossible peace, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. After hours of intense care, the kittens were declared stable. They were fed, warmed, and nestled together. But a new problem arose. They couldn't stay at the clinic indefinitely, and they certainly couldn't survive in the wild without a mother. "I'm taking them home," Hawk said, his voice firming. "Hawk, your heart," Dr. Thorne began, but Hawk cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "My heart has never felt better than it does right now," Hawk insisted. The drive back up the mountain felt fundamentally different. The truck was no longer a vessel for a lonely man heading toward an empty, silent house. It was carrying a family, strange, impossible, and bound by a debt of life that defied every law of nature. As the tires crunched over the familiar gravel of his driveway, Hawk looked in the rearview mirror at Sirocco, who sat silently in the back, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He wasn't just bringing home animals, he was bringing home a second chance. And as he stepped out into the twilight, the logs of his cabin no longer felt like the walls of a cage. They felt like the walls of a fortress. The drive back up the winding mountain road to the log cabin was no longer a journey of solitude. The old pickup truck, once a vessel for a lonely man drifting toward an inevitable end, had been transformed into a sanctuary on wheels. As Harlon Hawk, Merryweather navigated the familiar curves, he was hyper-aware of the cargo he carried. 3 fragile lives nestled against his chest and a silent, wild sentinel watching from the back. When they arrived, the cabin felt different, no longer a cold, lifeless place where time was measured in the slow ticking of a clock, but a home waiting to be awakened. Hawk's first act was to breathe life into the hearth. His gnarled hands, practiced in the ancient art of survival, coaxed flames from kindling until the room was bathed in a golden, flickering warmth. Near the fireplace, he constructed a nest using a cardboard box and soft, old blankets, arranging them with a precision born of newfound purpose. Sirocco, the bobcat, immediately claimed the space, curling her powerful body around the 3 shivering kittens, her presence providing the foundational heat they so desperately needed. Naming them was the next step, a ritual Hawk knew was necessary to transform anonymous survivors into individuals worthy of devotion. Wintermist, the white kitten, was named in honor of his late wife, Margaret, who had found a quiet joy in the first snowfall of every year. Speaking the name aloud was a breakthrough. Hawk had not uttered it since her funeral 5 years prior. Brindlewood, this kitten was named for a cherished childhood toy, a reminder of the loyalty and devotion he had learned as a boy. Ash Bloom, the smallest and weakest of the 3, she was named for the concept of rising and blooming from the ashes of a fire, a hope Hawk now held for himself as much as for her. The days that followed were a grueling but beautiful test of endurance. Hawk, who had previously been preparing for his own death, suddenly found himself responsible for the survival of others. Every 2 hours, around the clock, the kittens needed to be fed. He set alarms that cut through the mountain silence, waking in the darkness to heat formula to exact temperatures. With steady hands, he coaxed the tiny, hungry mouths to accept the bottle, supplementing what Sirocco could not provide on her own. It was exhausting work that left his bones aching, yet for the first time in years, he felt truly necessary. An extraordinary partnership formed between the man and the predator. While Hawk managed the logistics of formula and heat, Sirocco acted as the true mother. She groomed the kittens with her rough, sandpapery tongue and kept them anchored with her body. The cabin, once defined by the silence of grief, was now filled with a new rhythm. In the mornings, Hawk brewed English breakfast tea, the kind Margaret had loved, and played soft classical music or jazz on his old radio. He would sit by the fire and tell stories to the kittens, narrating his memories and his days. Though they could not understand his words, they seemed to listen, their small bodies relaxing at the vibrations of his voice. One evening, as the sound of Sirocco's deep, rhythmic purring filled the room like a living heartbeat, Hawk found himself overwhelmed. For the first time in a decade, he broke down in tears. They were not tears of sadness or regret, but of profound warmth, the overwhelming sensation of being part of something larger than his own mortality. Sirocco took her role as protector seriously, assigning herself the duty of night sentinel. Every night, she lay across the doorway to Hawk's bedroom, her jade eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire as she watched over the house. On the nights when Hawk's heart faltered, when the irregular beats woke him in a cold panic, he would look toward the door and see her shadow. In her presence, he felt a strange, ironclad safety. He was no longer a man waiting to die alone, he was a member of a pack. As the kittens began to grow, wrapped in a unique blend of wild instinct and human affection, Hawk began to document their journey. He pulled out a worn leather journal, writing late into the night by lamplight. He chronicled every milestone, every playful pounce, and every lesson Sirocco taught them. He jokingly referred to her as his Bobcat instructor, a title that brought a rare, genuine smile to his weathered face. He realized that in his 73rd year, at the edge of his life, he was finally discovering what it meant to be fully alive. The transition from late winter to the first hints of a mountain spring brought a change in the cabin's atmosphere. No longer were the kittens helpless infants confined to a cardboard box. They had transformed into adventurous juveniles, their legs growing stronger and their instincts sharper with every passing day. The log cabin, which had once felt like a tomb for Hawk's memories, had become a living, breathing academy of the wild. The Academy of the Wild. Sirocco proved to be an exemplary and rigorous mother, embodying the role of a strict teacher. She taught the kittens survival skills with a patience that fascinated Hawk. The hunt. Sirocco demonstrated how to stalk prey by crouching low and creeping across the cabin floor toward toys Hawk had provided. The climb. She scaled the log walls and the trees in the backyard, encouraging the three small followers to mimic her every move as they struggled to keep up. The warning. She taught them to recognize danger, her body going rigid with an instinctive warning whenever a predator passed nearby in the forest. As they grew, their personalities diverged into distinct reflections of Hawk's own life. Brindlewood was the mischievous explorer, constantly investigating every crevice of the forest, reminding Hawk of his own youthful hunger for adventure. Winter Mist remained gentle and quiet, often staring at the door as if waiting for a lost soul to return, mirroring the patient strength of Hawk's late wife, Margaret. Ash Bloom, the smallest at birth, had become the bravest and quickest, a fearless hunter who represented the man Hawk wished he could have been. The collapse. The rhythm of their lives was shattered one morning about 6 weeks after their arrival. Hawk was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for a simple soup, when the world suddenly tilted. A sudden drop in his blood pressure, combined with the underlying strain of his heart disease, caused the floor to rush up to meet him. As he lost consciousness, the last thing he heard was not silence, but a sound he had never heard before, Sirocco's voice. It wasn't a purr or a low growl, but a series of frantic, sharp, and urgent cries that echoed through the cabin. The Bobcat's unusual behavior did not go unnoticed. The Callahan family, who lived half a mile down the mountain, heard the commotion and sensed something was terribly wrong. They arrived at the cabin to find Sirocco pacing near the unconscious Hawk, her cries acting as a beacon. A heart reborn. Hawk was rushed to the hospital just in time. While the doctor stabilized him and adjusted his medications, they made a startling discovery. His overall condition had actually improved. His heart, though still damaged, was functioning with a strength that defied their previous prognosis. Dr. Thorne, visiting his friend and patient, could only shake his head in wonder. He joked that caring for the animals was the best cardiac therapy available, suggesting that the purpose Hawk had found in saving the kittens was actually saving him in return. The news of the Bobcat of Big Sky and the man she saved spread through the town like wildfire. Hawk, who had become a hermit after Margaret's death, suddenly found himself at the center of a community again. Neighbors brought casseroles, bread, and soup, more than he could ever eat. People stopped by not just to see the famous wild animal, but to reconnect with a man they had nearly forgotten. As the snow began to melt, revealing the green life beneath, Hawk realized he was no longer a lonely man waiting for the end. Inside him, a new life had been ignited by claws, fur, and the silent trust of a predator. At 73, on the edge of death, He had finally discovered what it meant to be fully alive. Part 5. The Gift of Letting Go. Spring passed with the speed of dreams, and before Harlon Hawk, Merryweather could fully grasp the miracle of his own recovery, summer arrived in Big Sky. The long daylight hours brought a warmth that seeped into the very logs of his cabin, transforming it from a place of cold isolation into a living, breathing home filled with noise, movement, and a profound sense of purpose. Hawk no longer looked at the wood beams above his bed as a weight. He looked at them as a shelter for the impossible family he had gained. The maturation of the pack. As the kittens grew from helpless infants into adventurous juveniles, Sirocco remained their primary instructor. She was a wild bobcat in every instinct, yet she proved to be an exemplary mother, teaching the trio every survival skill she possessed. Hawk would often watch from the porch as she demonstrated how to stalk prey, crouching low and creeping across the yard toward toys he had provided, or scaling the nearby trees with 3 small followers struggling to keep up. By midsummer, the kittens' personalities had emerged as distinctly as the mountain peaks. Brindlewood had become mischievous and curious, investigating every corner of the forest as if convinced adventure waited around every bend. Winter Mist was the gentle soul, preferring the warmth of the hearth and reflecting the quiet strength Hawk remembered in his late wife. Ash Bloom had grown into the bravest of the lot, a fearless hunter who mirrored the strength Sirocco herself possessed. Hawk joked with visitors that Sirocco was a strict teacher who never let them slack off, but one with a generous heart who never truly abandoned her duties. The vanishing and the vigil. The peace of summer was shattered one morning in late August when Hawk jolted awake at dawn with a cold feeling of wrongness. The cabin felt empty. He stumbled through the rooms, his heart racing, only to find that Sirocco was nowhere to be seen. Fear, sharp and physical, tightened his chest. He spent the entire day searching his property, his voice echoing through the hemlocks as he called her name into the unanswering woods. While the kittens, now nearly full-grown cats, seemed confused, they weren't distressed, they had each other. But for Hawk, the loss felt like a physical wound. As night fell, he took a wooden chair out to the porch and sat motionless, his eyes unblinking as he watched the trailing. He did not eat, he did not move. He simply waited, caught between hope and the dread that the wild had finally reclaimed what it had lent him. The hunter's offering. It was only when the moon rose over the mountains, casting a silver light across the yard, that a shadow emerged from the trees. Sirocco returned quietly, moving with her characteristic fluid grace. In her mouth, she carried a freshly caught fish, its scales gleaming wetly in the moonlight. She walked up the porch steps and laid the fish at Hawk's feet. It was her first gift, an acknowledgement that Hawk was not just a caretaker, but a member of her family. As silent tears fell down his weathered cheeks, Hawk whispered, "You're sharing, you beautiful, impossible creature." The final transition. After that night, Sirocco's absences grew more frequent and lasted longer. Hawk worried at first, but he began to understand the silent communication between Sirocco and her adopted kittens. They would touch noses, groom each other, and share stories in a language of instinct that Hawk could observe but never fully join. He realized she was preparing to leave, not out of a lack of love, but out of trust. She had saved the kittens, and in the process, she had saved Hawk. Now nature was calling her back to the high territory where she belonged. As summer turned toward autumn and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter, the day finally came when she did not return. The cabin felt quiet in a way it hadn't been since that foggy morning months ago. Hawk left food on the porch every evening and kept the door slightly ajar just in case, but deep down he knew the truth. He sat beside the 3 cats, now beautiful and strong in their own right, and repeated a new truth to himself. To love is to let go, to trust that what you gave was enough. He was not sad. He understood that she was wild, and the mountains were her true home. She had given him months of companionship and a reason to live, and now it was his turn to be the guardian of the legacy she left behind. The great wheel of the seasons turned once more over the jagged peaks of Big Sky, Montana. Summer's golden heat faded into the crisp, biting air of autumn, which in turn surrendered to the iron-gray silence of winter. For Harlon Hawk Merryweather, this year had been different from any of the 73 that preceded it. The cabin no longer smelled of dust and old memories. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and the vibrant life of 3 healthy, full-grown cats. The legend of the mountain. Hawk's 74th birthday passed quietly, though not in the solitude he had once expected. His follow-up appointments with Dr. Thorne at the Reimerus Clinic had become routine, yet they never failed to baffle the medical staff. His heart condition, which had once been a countdown to an ending, remained remarkably stable, almost impossibly so. Dr. Thorne often shook his head in wonder, half joking that he should start writing prescriptions for kittens instead of pills, as the purpose of caring for these lives had become the best medicine Hawk could ever take. The story of the man and the bobcat had woven itself into the fabric of Big Sky. Hawk's home became a destination for curious children, the lonely seeking hope, and even university researchers, fascinated by the unprecedented bond between a human and a wild predator. Hawk welcomed them all, sharing the story of the foggy morning and the miracle that followed, realizing his journey now belonged to anyone who needed proof that love could arrive from the most unexpected sources. The return in the snow. On a day when the snow fell in a white silence, covering the world in a pristine powder, Hawk sat on his porch steps wrapped in his heavy coat, the very same coat that had once cradled 3 dying kittens against his chest. Winter mist, brindlewood, and ash bloom curled around his legs, their fur gleaming and their bodies strong. The cold wind didn't make him shiver. The warmth within his heart, a heart that had learned to beat with purpose again, kept him steady. Suddenly, Ash Bloom lifted her head, her ears alert and twitching. All 3 cats sprang to their feet simultaneously, running into the snow-covered yard. Hawk stood up slowly, his heart pounding with a familiar hope. From the shadows of the forest, a familiar shape emerged with unmistakable, fluid grace. It was Sirocco, but she was not alone. Following closely behind her were 2 small bobcat cubs, their eyes full of life and intelligence as they moved cautiously through the fresh powder. Tears welled in Hawk's eyes, blurring the silver landscape. No words were spoken. Some moments transcend the need for language. The 3 domestic cats ran forward, touching noses with their mother in a joyful greeting before circling the young cubs with curiosity and welcome. It was a reunion and an introduction happening at once, a bridge between the wild and the domestic. The final entry. Sirocco did not step into the yard or approach the house. She stopped at the boundary where the forest met the clearing, a silent acknowledgement of her true nature. Her gaze, soft and knowing, rested on Hawk for a long moment. In her eyes, he saw recognition and gratitude. Hawk bowed his head in respect and placed his hand over his chest, thanking the force that had brought them together on that foggy morning. That evening, under the soft glow of an oil lamp, Hawk opened his worn leather journal to the final page. With winter mist sleeping in his lap, he wrote the words that summarized his second chance at life. I once thought I was only existing, waiting for the end. But it turns out that life begins when we choose to love something beyond ourselves. I was saved by a wild animal who should have feared me, but instead trusted me. I was given a second chance by choosing to say yes when I could have turned away. A circle complete. Hawk eventually closed the journal and sat listening to the symphony of his home, the crackling fire, the soft breathing of the cats, and the mountain wind. He knew that while his heart was damaged and he would eventually die, he would die having truly lived. That night, Hawk smiled in his sleep, his dreams full of running water and the laughter of his late wife. His heart beat with a persistence no longer fueled by fear, but by gratitude for an impossible encounter. High in the forest, Sirocco moved through the darkness with her cubs, teaching them the ways of the wild. Occasionally, she would pause at the edge of the trees to look back at the warm lights of the cabin glowing in the distance. They were separated by nature and distance, but bound by a memory that would never break. They had saved each other, and in the quiet of the Montana winter, that was enough.